Mardin Massacre. In May 2009, a wedding celebration was underway in the village of Bilge, in Turkey's southeastern Mardin province. The ceremony had been completed. Guests from both families had gathered in a large room for the reception. Dozens of people were present. Among those at the celebration were members of the Çelebi family, including the bride, Sevgi Çelebi, and her new husband, Habib Ari. The Bilge Massacre, as it became known, did not arise from a dispute that broke out at the wedding itself. It was planned. Men who had arrived at or near the gathering produced hand grenades and opened fire on the assembled guests. The attack was concentrated in the room where guests had gathered. The violence was immediate and severe across the space. 44 people were killed. The confirmed dead included women, children, and the bride herself. The groom's sister, Rukin Ari, a 4-year-old girl, was also killed. The bride's father, Samil Salebi, was wounded but survived. The wedding cleric was killed. Members of the Ari family were killed in groups. One entire family, composed of 2 parents and 6 children between the ages of 3 and 12, was killed in the attack. Their deaths, all 8 of them, marked the single most devastating loss within the broader casualty count. 6 of the total dead were children, 16 were women. Survivors, including 2 girls who had hidden beneath the bodies of those killed, were recovered by responding emergency services. Security forces sealed roads into the village in the immediate aftermath. The attack was widely condemned across Turkey. The number of dead made it among the deadliest single incidents of violence in the country in decades. Turkish authorities investigated and made arrests. Early official statements ruled out the PKK. One explanation offered involved a long-running family feud in the village. Several individuals were arrested and held in connection with the attack. The attackers had arrived disguised in masks and fled toward the nearby Syrian border as a sandstorm intensified. The attack became one of the defining moments in Turkey's national discussion about violence in the southeast of the country, that a wedding, the most protected of civilian occasions in Turkish cultural life, could be turned into a scene of mass killing attracted sustained attention from national and international media alike. It also focused legislative attention on the persistent conditions of instability and interfamily conflict in the remote southeastern provinces. Prime Minister Erdogan declared 3 days of national mourning. Turkish authorities arrested multiple suspects in connection with the attack in the weeks that followed. 44 people were confirmed dead. The bride, Sevgi Çelebi, was among those killed. The cause of death in each case was injuries sustained in the attack on the wedding gathering in Bilge village, Mardin province, Turkey. Groom kills bride. In July 2015, a wedding reception was underway in Mersin province, in southern Turkey. The ceremony had been completed earlier that day. By the time the reception was in progress, guests from both families were present. The venue held the kind of crowd that a family wedding draws: relatives, neighbors, friends, people who had traveled to mark the occasion. Mersin is a large coastal city on the Mediterranean shore of southern Turkey. The surrounding province extends inland through agricultural flatlands. The wedding was a family event. The celebration was moving through its expected course. Food had been served. People were gathered in conversation. The atmosphere of the earlier hours of the reception carried the routine weight of a family occasion. The groom was present among the guests. He had completed the ceremony that day. He was legally registered as the owner of the firearm he was carrying. The weapon's presence at the event was not in itself reported as unusual in the context of rural southern Turkish celebrations, where the carrying of firearms has been a feature of certain traditional gatherings. This practice is documented throughout Turkey's rural regions, particularly in the south and east, and the repeated injuries and deaths it produces have been a consistent subject of public safety campaigns by Turkish authorities. The campaigns note that the presence of firearms at events involving alcohol, family tensions, and heightened emotion creates a combination of risk factors that transforms any dispute into a potentially lethal one. The groom on this evening had a loaded weapon and a grievance the public record does not fully disclose. What happened next was not reported in any source as having been preceded by an obvious altercation visible to all guests. The public record does not confirm a specific trigger event in the moments immediately before the shooting. The groom produced the firearm and shot the bride during the reception. She was struck. She fell. Guests who had been standing nearby moved away from the scene immediately. The reception, which had been proceeding as a family gathering, became a scene of immediate crisis. People scattered. Some fled the venue. Others moved toward those who had been hit. The groom then turned the weapon on himself. He fired and sustained a self-inflicted injury. He did not die from that injury. He remained at the scene, wounded, until emergency services arrived. Several other guests were reported wounded during the incident. Emergency services were contacted and dispatched to the venue. Medical teams arrived and began attending to those who had been shot. The bride was assessed by emergency responders. Her injuries were severe. She was pronounced dead. She did not survive. The groom received medical treatment for his self-inflicted gunshot wound. He survived. Following his discharge from medical care, Turkish police took him into custody. He was charged in connection with the murder under Turkish law. The motive for the shooting was not publicly confirmed in detail in international reporting. Turkey has documented a persistent pattern of domestic violence escalating at and around wedding events, often linked to disputes over arranged marriages, financial disagreements between families, or grievances about the union itself that surface on the occasion of the ceremony. In each such case, the presence of firearms, which are common at traditional southern Turkish celebrations, transforms what would otherwise be a confrontation into a fatal one. The bride was pronounced dead at the reception. The cause of death was a gunshot wound. The groom was arrested and faced murder charges. Celebration fire, Pakistan. In March 2020, a large outdoor wedding celebration was taking place in Peshawar, in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of northwestern Pakistan. Hundreds of guests were present. The event was underway in the open air, consistent with the scale and setting of large family weddings in that region. Food, music, and the congregation of extended families marked the evening. Peshawar sits at the eastern end of the Khyber Pass, a city with a long history and a densely populated urban core extending into surrounding districts. The celebration was a significant gathering. Weddings in the region regularly draw guests numbering in the hundreds, with multiple generations of family present across a single venue. The scale of such gatherings is part of their meaning, the full extended network of a family, assembled in one place to witness and participate in the occasion. Celebratory gunfire has been a traditional feature of certain wedding celebrations in parts of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and other areas of the region for generations. The practice, known informally as firing in the air, involves guests discharging firearms upward as an expression of joy during key moments of a celebration. Pakistani authorities had issued repeated public warnings about the practice in the years and months before this event. Those warnings addressed the documented danger that ballistic rounds fired into the air do not simply disappear. They reach a peak altitude and return to Earth, carrying enough force to be lethal. The physics of this are simple and well understood. A bullet fired straight up decelerates against gravity, reaches its apex, and falls. The terminal velocity of a returning round depends on the caliber and angle of fire, but documented cases across Pakistan, Afghanistan, and other countries confirm that falling rounds retain enough force to kill. The warnings issued by Pakistani authorities were not abstract. They referenced specific prior deaths. They were not heated. On the evening of this wedding, multiple individuals were firing weapons into the air throughout the event. The atmosphere was festive. The gunfire had been occurring at intervals consistent with celebration. There was nothing in the early part of the evening that distinguished this gathering from hundreds of similar events that had taken place in the region. Bullets fired into the air returned to Earth and struck guests in the crowd below. At least 3 people were hit with fatal results. The impacts were not concentrated in a single location. The crowd was spread across the outdoor venue, and the falling rounds came down across that space. Guests who had been celebrating moments before were struck without warning from above. The source of any individual round could not immediately be identified. Because multiple individuals had been firing throughout the evening, panic followed immediately. The crowd dispersed. People moved away from those who had fallen. Others tried to assist the wounded where they lay. The festive atmosphere of the gathering collapsed entirely. Emergency services were contacted and responded to the scene. The dead and wounded were transported to nearby hospitals. Medical teams received multiple patients. At least 3 of those brought in did not survive. Multiple other guests were wounded and required treatment. Police arrived and began the process of investigation. The challenge facing investigators was substantial, because numerous individuals had been firing weapons into the air throughout the event. Identifying which specific firearm had discharged the rounds responsible for each fatality required ballistic analysis and witness interviews. The crowd had been large. The number of individuals who had discharged weapons during the evening was not small. Investigators gathered evidence from the scene, collected weapons, and conducted interviews with witnesses. The identification of specific individuals responsible for the fatal rounds was complicated by those conditions. No confirmed named convictions appeared in international reporting from the event. The investigation was opened and pursued by Pakistani police. At least 3 guests were pronounced dead. The cause of death in each case was gunshot wounds sustained from ballistic rounds, falling from above. Reception bombing, Afghanistan. On August 17, 2019, a wedding reception was underway inside a rented hall in western Kabul, Afghanistan. The hall was full. Hundreds of guests had gathered for the celebration. Families, including women and children, were present throughout the venue. The event had been in progress for some time by the time the evening reached its later hours. Kabul in 2019 remained a city where large public gatherings took place, despite the ongoing conflict across the country. Wedding halls were a feature of the city's civilian life. They were rented for large celebrations, built to accommodate the scale of extended Afghan family gatherings. The halls themselves had become symbols of civilian persistence in a city that had known decades of war. Spending heavily on a single evening, filling a room with family and music, was an act of assertion as much as celebration. The hall, known as the Dubai City Wedding Hall, and located in a largely Shia Hazara neighborhood of western Kabul, was packed on that night. Guests occupied every section of the space. Music had been playing. The atmosphere of the reception was that of a large family event at its height. Security in Kabul, while present in various forms throughout the city, was not uniformly capable of screening every individual entering every civilian venue. Wedding halls drew large crowds, often with guests arriving across extended periods at the start of the evening. A suicide bomber entered the hall. The bomber detonated explosives inside the venue. The blast occurred in the men's section of the hall, near the stage where musicians were playing. The detonation was centered within the hall itself, meaning the full force of the explosion was contained within the structure and directed outward through the crowd. The impact was immediate and severe across a wide section of the venue. Guests closest to the point of detonation sustained the worst of the blast. The structural damage to the hall was significant. Those in sections further from the center of the explosion were affected by the pressure wave, debris, and the collapse of materials within the building. Survivors fled the venue in the immediate aftermath. Emergency responders were contacted and began mobilizing across Kabul. Ambulances and emergency vehicles converged on the area. Responders arriving. At the hall encountered a scene of mass casualties inside and around the building. The dead and wounded were spread across the interior and the surrounding area. The shoes of victims were photographed outside the hall the following morning, a detail that appeared in international news coverage and became one of the images associated with the attack. Kabul's hospitals received patients throughout the night. The scale of the wounded population exceeded the immediate capacity of individual facilities, requiring distribution across the city's medical infrastructure. Some of those critically injured were transported abroad for treatment in the days that followed. The initial death toll confirmed by Afghan Interior Ministry officials was 63 people killed, with 182 wounded. As those critically injured were treated in subsequent days, the death toll rose further. The final confirmed toll reached 92 killed, making it the deadliest attack in Kabul since January 2018, and one of the deadliest single attacks on a civilian gathering during the entire period of the Afghan conflict. The Taliban publicly denied responsibility for the attack. ISIS-K, the Afghan affiliate of the Islamic State, claimed responsibility, stating the bomber was a Pakistani fighter who targeted the Shia gathering. The groom, Mirwais Elmi, and the bride both survived the attack, though they lost multiple family members. The groom told Afghan media he had lost his brother, friends, and relatives. "I've lost hope. I lost my brother. I lost my friends. I lost my relatives," he told a local broadcaster from the hospital. The bride's father reported that 14 of his family members had lost their lives. The families had reportedly discussed the timing of the wedding beforehand, trying to schedule it in a way that might reduce the risk of an attack. Kabul's wedding halls were known targets, and the families were aware of that risk. They held the wedding anyway because there is no safe schedule for a wedding in a city that has been at war for decades. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani condemned the attack and declared a day of national mourning. He urged the international community to recognize the threat posed by ISIS-K and vowed to eliminate its safe havens. 92 people were confirmed dead. The cause of death in each case was injuries sustained in a suicide bombing at the Dubai City Wedding Hall in western Kabul on August 17, 2019. Poisoned at reception. On July 29, 2023, a family lunch took place at a private home in Leongatha, in Victoria, Australia. The occasion was a family gathering that brought together members connected by marriage. The gathering took place at the home of Erin Patterson, the estranged daughter-in-law of the couple invited. It was a domestic setting, a private home in a small rural town. Leongatha is a small rural town in South Gippsland, approximately 135 kilometers southeast of Melbourne. It sits in a farming region. The surrounding landscape is green and quiet. It is the kind of place where a family lunch invitation carries no inherent alarm. People host family members for meals. It is ordinary. There was nothing visible at the time of the invitation that would have caused the guests to decline. The meal was prepared by Erin Patterson. A beef Wellington dish was among the food served. Guests sat down to eat. The meal proceeded. The afternoon continued. Nothing in the immediate immediate experience of eating the food disclosed that anything was wrong. Death cap mushroom poisoning does not present immediately. The symptoms of Amanita phalloides toxicity are delayed. A person can consume a lethal dose and feel nothing in the first several hours. The gap between ingestion and the onset of symptoms can be long enough that the connection between the meal and the illness is not obvious when symptoms first appear. In the hours after the lunch, guests began to become ill. The symptoms that emerged were consistent with the poisoning that was later confirmed. Guests who had eaten the meal became seriously unwell. The severity of their condition escalated. Emergency services were contacted. The affected guests were transported to hospital facilities. Medical teams began assessing and treating the patients. Toxicology testing was conducted. The results confirmed the presence of Amanita phalloides, the death cap mushroom, in the food that had been consumed. Death cap mushrooms are among the most toxic fungi known. Even a small amount consumed can be fatal. There is no reliable antidote, and the damage the toxin causes to the liver and kidneys can be irreversible by the time symptoms become apparent. 3 guests died as a result of the poisoning. Don Patterson and his wife Gail Patterson, the parents of Aaron's estranged husband Simon, died on August 4th and August 5th respectively. Gail's sister, Heather Wilkinson, also died on August 4th. A 4th guest, Ian Wilkinson, Heather's husband, survived after weeks in intensive care, including time in an induced coma. Investigators pursued the case. Charges were filed against Aaron Patterson. She was charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder in connection with the poisoning of the guests at the lunch. The investigation also examined separate alleged incidents involving her estranged husband, Simon Patterson, who had been hospitalized on multiple occasions in the 2 years prior to the lunch, with symptoms that prosecutors alleged were consistent with earlier poisoning attempts. Those charges were ultimately dropped before trial, and the jury was not informed of them during proceedings. The case proceeded through the Australian court system. Patterson pleaded not guilty, maintaining the poisoning was a terrible accident caused by mistakenly including forage mushrooms she did not know were death caps. On July 7th, 2025, a jury convicted Patterson on all charges, 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. She was subsequently sentenced to life in prison with a non-parole period of 33 years, one of the longest sentences ever handed to a woman in Australia. 3 people were pronounced dead. The cause of death was confirmed by toxicology as death cap mushroom poisoning. Aaron Patterson was convicted of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. While the case drew sustained international attention from the moment the poisoning became public, in part because of the setting, a private family lunch at a suburban home in rural Victoria, and in part because of the substance involved. Death cap mushrooms are implicated in the majority of fatal mushroom poisonings worldwide. Amanita phalloides is deceptively unremarkable in appearance. It produces no immediate symptoms that distinguish it from food-based illness. The toxin it contains attacks liver cells by preventing protein synthesis, and by the time the full force of organ failure becomes apparent, the window for effective intervention has often already closed. A person may feel unwell without understanding why, seek treatment, and still not survive. Ian Wilkinson, the sole survivor, spent nearly 2 months in hospital, including time in an intensive care unit before he was discharged. The jury's verdict, delivered after 6 days of deliberation following a 10-week trial, indicated they accepted the prosecution's argument that the poisoning was deliberate. Patterson was subsequently sentenced to life in prison with a non-parole period of 33 years, one of the longest sentences ever handed to a woman in Australia. She has filed an application for leave to appeal her conviction. Shooting in Mississippi. In June 2022, an outdoor wedding reception was taking place in Benton County, in northern Mississippi. The county sits in the hill country of the northeastern corner of the state, a rural area of small towns and farmland. The celebration was a family event held outside with guests gathered across the grounds of the venue. The reception was the kind of gathering that marks the close of a wedding day in a rural community. Family members, neighbors, and friends had assembled. The ceremony had been completed. The celebration was underway. The outdoor setting accommodated the crowd across the venue grounds. The evening had been in progress for some time before anything went wrong. A dispute arose. The public record describes the trigger as a dispute that escalated into gunfire. What the record confirms is that shots were fired at the reception. The bride's father was shot. He was struck during the shooting and sustained a fatal injury. Several other guests were also hit. Witnesses at the scene described the celebration turning abruptly from noise and gathering into the sound of gunfire and the sight of people falling and running. Outdoor wedding venues offer no cover. When shooting begins at an event held in an open space, the geometry of exposure is total. There's no building to duck inside, no structural barrier between the guests and the line of fire. Those who were standing in the crowd when the shots were fired could only scatter. The shooting sent the crowd into immediate dispersal. Guests moved away from the area where the shots had been fired. People sought cover wherever terrain allowed. Those who had been struck were attended to by others at the scene, while emergency services were contacted. Emergency responders arrived at the venue in Benton County. Medical teams assessed the bride's father. His injuries were severe. He was pronounced dead. Law enforcement identified a suspect responsible for the shooting. He was located and taken into custody. Charges were filed against him in connection with the shooting, including charges relating to the homicide of the bride's father. The case was processed through Mississippi's court system. The bride's father was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was a gunshot wound sustained at the wedding reception. Expecting to leave it as a married woman at the start of something, instead left it as a daughter in mourning before the night was over. The two things existed simultaneously, a marriage that had just begun and a loss that could not have been anticipated. That is the character of violence at weddings. It is not just what it takes, it is what it takes it from. Bride killed, Texas. In June 2021, a wedding reception was underway at an indoor venue in Houston, Texas. The ceremony had been completed. The couple had moved into the reception, which was in progress at the time of the incident. Guests filled the venue. Music was playing. The celebration was at the stage where dancing and gathering marked the height of the evening. Houston is the largest city in Texas and the fourth largest in the United States. Its neighborhoods extend across a wide urban and suburban landscape. The venue where the reception was being held was an indoor facility, the kind of enclosed space designed to host large gatherings. Guests were inside. The walls of the venue separated the celebration from the street and the surrounding area outside. Those walls are not impenetrable. A wall that stops sound does not stop a bullet. A structure designed to hold a party is not designed to withstand gunfire originating from outside it. The material difference between the inside of a reception hall and the street is a few inches of building material. On this evening, those inches were not enough. The bride was inside the reception with her guests. The evening was proceeding. Nothing in the confirmed public record indicates that any disturbance had occurred inside the venue prior to the incident. Outside the venue in the surrounding area, gunfire erupted. The shooting outside the building was not directed at the wedding. It originated in the vicinity of the venue and was separate from the event itself. The exact circumstances of the gunfire outside were the subject of the Houston Police Department investigation that followed. A bullet penetrated the outer structure of the venue and struck the bride while she was inside the reception. She was hit. The impact of being struck by a bullet that had traveled through the structure of the building brought the celebration to an immediate halt. Guests around her responded. Emergency services were contacted without delay. The priority became getting her to a medical facility as quickly as possible. She was transported to a Houston trauma hospital. The medical team that received her assessed her injuries. The injuries sustained from a bullet wound of this nature were severe. The treatment provided at the hospital was not sufficient to save her life. She died from her injuries. Houston Police Department opened a homicide investigation. Detectives worked to establish the origin of the gunfire outside the venue, identify the weapon or weapons involved, and determine who had been firing in the area at the time of the incident. The investigation confirmed that the shooting outside was not targeted at the wedding or at the bride. The bullet that killed her was a stray round that crossed the boundary of the structure during an unrelated shooting event in the vicinity. She was inside a celebration. The violence that killed her had nothing to do with that celebration. It was simply in range. She was pronounced dead at the hospital. The cause of death was a gunshot wound sustained when a stray bullet penetrated the venue during her wedding reception. Stray bullet fatalities are documented with depressing regularity in American cities, and Houston, as one of the country's largest urban areas, has its share of them. The common thread in stray bullet deaths is the randomness of the geometry involved. A shot fired in one direction at one target travels until it hits something else. Sometimes that something else is a wall. Sometimes it is a person standing behind the wall. The bride on this evening was in a space that was not connected to any dispute, was not a target, was not part of the chain of events that led someone to discharge a weapon in the vicinity of her reception. She was simply located in the path of a bullet that did not know where the wedding was. Car Ram's wedding. On December 12, 2013, a convoy of vehicles was traveling through Al-Baida Governorate in central Yemen. The convoy was a wedding procession. Multiple vehicles were carrying guests associated with the celebration, moving along a remote dirt road through mountainous terrain near the city of Rada. The procession was transporting the bride and family members to the groom's village. Wedding processions of this kind, traveling between locations by road, are a documented feature of celebrations in rural Yemeni communities. Al-Baida Governorate Governorate is located in the central interior of Yemen, a region of mountainous terrain and scattered rural settlements. The roads through the province connect communities across a landscape that is isolated from the major population centers of the country. On that December day, the convoy moved along one of those roads, carrying wedding guests as part of the extended celebration. The procession numbered approximately 50 to 60 people traveling in 11 vehicles, including cars and pickup trucks, carrying ceremonial ribbons and bows. A United States drone strike hit the convoy. 4 Hellfire missiles were launched at the procession without warning. Multiple vehicles were struck. The impact of the drone strike on a convoy of vehicles carrying wedding guests was immediate and severe. At least 12 people were killed. 15 others were wounded, 6 of them seriously. The dead and wounded were among the families of the bride and groom. Survivors and local residents reached the scene of the strike in the aftermath. What they found were the remains of vehicles that had been carrying wedding guests. The bodies of those killed were recovered from the convoy. The wounded were attended to at the scene and transported for medical care, including a journey of approximately 90 minutes by road to a hospital in Rada City. The aftermath of the strike generated significant investigation. Human Rights Watch, the international human rights organization, conducted an investigation into the incident. Researchers traveled to Al-Baida Governorate, spoke with survivors and community members, and reviewed the evidence available about the convoy and the people traveling in it. The findings of the Human Rights Watch investigation confirmed that the convoy was a civilian wedding procession. The organization documented that the dead included shepherds, farmers, and migrant workers, and that the bride herself received a superficial facial wound and survived. The Yemeni parliament also investigated the incident. The United States government did not officially acknowledge any role in the attack, but U.S. and Yemeni officials speaking to media described the target as a wanted member of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula who was wounded and escaped. The Yemeni government acknowledged civilian deaths in connection with the incident. The local governor and military commander called the casualties a mistake and distributed money and rifles to the families of the dead and wounded, a traditional Yemeni gesture of apology. At least 12 people traveling in the wedding convoy were pronounced dead. The cause of death was injuries sustained in a drone strike on the procession near Rada al-Baida Governorate, Yemen, on December 12, 2013. 3 of the 12 died of their wounds in hospital after surviving the initial strike. 6 others required treatment for significant injuries, including amputations and the loss of eyes. The case became one of the most cited examples of the documented risks of drone strike operations in civilian environments. Human Rights Watch's 28-page report titled "A Wedding That Became a Funeral" detailed the specific identities of those killed: shepherds, cot farmers, and men who worked as illegal migrant laborers in Saudi Arabia, ranging in age from 20 to 65. None were recorded on the Yemeni government's list of wanted militants. The local governor and military commander's response, paying compensation and distributing rifles to bereaved families, a traditional Yemeni gesture of apology, was taken by Human Rights Watch and other organizations as an implicit acknowledgement that those killed were civilians. The United States never officially acknowledged conducting the strike, and no formal accountability process for the deaths was ever confirmed in public records. The Yemeni parliament passed a non-binding resolution in the wake of the incident calling for a halt to U.S. drone strikes in Yemen. The resolution had no enforcement mechanism, but reflected the scale of public anger in a country where the drone campaign had been ongoing for years, and where the government's ability to address civilian casualties was limited by its own dependence on American counterterrorism support. 12 families lost members on a road on a December afternoon, in a procession decorated for a wedding. The bride survived. She received a superficial wound to her face. What she carried back from the road in Al-Baida Governorate is not recorded in the public accounts of investigators and reporters who documented what happened there. The report is titled "A Wedding That Became a Funeral." That title does not require elaboration. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.